So, shall we talk about the slap?
Let's do that. Yeah.
Do you want to explain the slap in case anybody around the world has missed it?
Yeah, I don't think anyone has actually. It's been covered quite a lot, hasn't it? But yeah, I mean, the Oscars recently, Will Smith has now famously slapped Chris Rock, the presenter, for offending his wife during one of his jokes, and obviously it's caused some controversy and there's some split decisions around whether it was a genuine slap or a staged slap or some kind of publicity stunt and all this sort of stuff. So, but it's certainly, it's made lots of headlines and got them both in the headlines.
So what's the point? I mean, how does it relate to us? We work with businesses and business people, say up to about 100, 150 employees. I mean, how does that sort of thing, that Will Smith losing it or apparently losing it, how does that relate in real life to normal people?
Well, it relates to everyday life, doesn't it? I mean, we all have moments when we could potentially lose our composure and react to something, whether that's a challenge or a comment or it could be any number of things. Road rage, it could be anything.
God forbid. Yeah. So have you ever done it? I mean, I'll share you my story. Well, not slap. No. Have you ever lost it in the moment with somebody because of a? I'll share mine if you share yours.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah, I'm sure I have. I mean, I'm quite a laid back guy generally. I've never got physical with anyone, that's for sure.
No, me neither. That's for sure.
But yeah, I would certainly. I'm quite an emotional guy, so as you know, so I would.
You've been triggered.
Yeah, I've
let me share. Let me share you my story, right? And then it might trigger a story with you.
Well, let's just say there was a period in my life where I was probably getting triggered 7 or 8 times a day, and that was a good day.
Right.
So
okay.
We can talk about that if you want.
Well, I'll share because I've got a very specific event that I can remember, and it goes back. I was in my early 20s, and at that time, I was working with a small agency, and we used to take a traveling show around the country. It was like a traveling ideal home show. And when you're on the road, you meet people, and I met this woman, and something kicked off between us. But as far as I was aware, it was something that was just within the crew. It's like. It wasn't one of those things that what goes on the road stays on the road. I mean, we carried it on afterwards. It was a relationship, not just a fling, But I was quite private about it. I'm still, very private about all that sort of stuff. I'm not someone who likes to share it. And so, with that in mind as the background, I don't know whether you can imagine how I felt when, because I was living in London at the time. My parents lived in North Wales. I don't know if you can imagine how I felt when I phoned up. I hadn't spoken to my mum and dad for a couple of weeks, and they said, "Oh, here you've got a new girlfriend."
Wow!
And it was like, where did that come from? It's like a real
shock.
It was like a slap, And so my mind, your brain starts going. You think, okay, where did that come from? And you think back to, well, who's in common? Who do my mum and dad know that are connected to the people in the business that I'm working with? Join some dots. And so I went back into work the next day, and I laid into the person who I thought it was.
Yeah.
And of course it wasn't. And when I say laid into, I mean verbally. I didn't strike him or anything, but it was like I got it completely wrong. But because I had been like so triggered, and I was raging, and it was like I couldn't see past. My thinking didn't allow me to go past that very narrow focus of who I'd identified as being the cause, the culprit, So that was a very big lesson to me when I then discovered it wasn't that person. And of course you then feel sheepish and stupid and apologetic and all that sort of stuff.
But,
of course. The damage is done then. At that point, it's very, very hard to come back from that, and in fact, it proved impossible to come back in my professional relationship with that person. So that was difficult. So I don't know whether you've got anything like that in your past life or not.
Well, I did have a challenging relationship, as you know, which and you know, the other person had mental health issues,
Uh-huh.
which, you know, you try and be understanding about as much as possible. And I think I
Yeah.
stretched the limit of understanding, if I'm honest. But
Right.
but when that mental health is coming at you in personal attacks, it can be very difficult
Mm.
to keep a clear head.
Yeah.
And you know that, I mean, you know, that particular person was playing a game of just going through a number of things to see which would trigger me, and it is very difficult. And I'm normally quite composed and calm,
Yeah. Well, absolutely, you are. Yeah.
and I did lose it a couple of times where you retaliate or respond,
Hmm.
and then you're left in a position where you're not proud of succumbing to that
Yeah.
at all,
Yeah.
irrespective of how hurtful and damaging it is that's coming, you know, the attack that's coming at you.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I've been in that position where you just get a rush of blood to the head, and you just go and you respond
Yeah.
because you can't take it anymore. And
So,
I don't know whether that's what happened with Will Smith, though, to be fair.
well, I was just going to come back to that really, because it's like, you know, when you think about someone like Will Smith, hugely experienced of being in the public eye, and when you're in the public eye, and you know, let's be frank, as an actor, you have to court the public eye. So I can remember when I was in the national newspaper business, being a celebrity, being a public celebrity is a really thin tightrope that you have to walk, because you have to court the publicity to get the, I mean, let's face it, it's about getting free advertising for the next film or the next song or whatever it is you're doing. You know, that's essentially what it's about. But of course, the minute you do that, you then open yourself up for scrutiny in your private life. You know, there is no distinction. You know, once you've crossed that boundary and you start courting publicity, you're then no longer into control of that publicity. So you have to, when you're in the public eye, develop the ability to handle all the negative stuff as well as the positive stuff. So what I'm really interested in is, if this wasn't a publicity stunt, and we'll talk in a minute about why it might be a publicity stunt, what was it that went on in Will Smith's head that overrode all that vast amount of experience that he's got that caused him to do it?
Yeah, and that's, I think that's where there's you know, the footage kind of paints a very confusing picture of that, doesn't it? Because of his initial response and then his second response. If anything, he's kind of, you know, if you looked at the training that he would have had and the coaching that he would have had to kind of cope with that kind of negative publicity, you know, for lack of a better word, or scrutiny, you know, his reactions were kind of the opposite of what you would think. You know, because his initial reaction was to laugh, and then his second reaction was to get up and act on it in a very different way.
Right.
And I found that the most bizarre, because most people might, their initial reaction might be rush of blood to the head.
Yeah.
And then, hang on a sec, let's just get some perspective here.
Okay.
But of course, this was the opposite, which I find baffling.
And is there anything that comes to mind that you think might have provoked that?
Well, I think the thing that comes to mind for me is the person that sat to his left, who obviously shot him a look of displeasure or dissatisfaction at the way he'd responded.
You're talking about his wife now.
Joke. His wife, who I'm not a fan of, I must say. I've never been a fan of her.
I don't know anything about her.
Well, from day one, she's just any sort of press and publicity around her when she was in her early career was pretty negative, and she does have this air of being a bit of a manipulator.
Okay.
And so, you know, when you watch that footage back, his initial reaction is to laugh, and then obviously his wife shoots him a glance, and then he gets up and acts. Right. And there's still a lag, because obviously the camera flicks between seeing him seated and then seeing Chris Rock carrying on presented, and there's still, I mean, he's I think from memory he's like at the front row. So there's still quite a lag between him getting up and moving up to act and carry out the slap, and I don't know what happened there, but it's
see, I hadn't heard that analysis of it before. That's new to me. And the thing that comes to my mind there, Chris, is it immediately, if that's the case, it immediately takes it out of the realm of being an emotional trigger reaction to one that is like, now it's like a considered assault.
Yeah.
You know, and that's a very different thing. And if that's the case, that makes it even more incredible that he would have done that, you know?
Yeah, that's why I struggle with it, because it's completely, you know, it's the opposite. And I've also, I mean, there's been other footage released now as well, of someone who was filming with their phone behind where Will Smith was sat.
Yeah.
And they were filming his wife, and she was then laughing when he
really
got up and slapped Chris Rock.
Okay.
So you know, there's all this kind of interesting it's interesting dynamics at play there, I think. But
well, look, let's look at the other side of what might be going on here, because and this is a pretty cynical view. Again, it's not one that I've thought of and hatched. It's one I read, but I believe, although it could be a cynical view, I think there could be some credibility behind it, given the way big business works. And that is that it was all a publicity stunt, because the main sponsors of the Oscars were pharmaceutical companies, and I think there was one main one of the big names. And Will Smith's wife has alopecia.
That's right.
And the joke was about her baldness. I think Chris Rock referred to her coming out with a new G.I. Jane film. Of course, the company involved has a new alopecia drug about to be released pretty soon. So, you know, from nowhere, there's a massive exposure now of alopecia as well. I mean, obviously, a lot of people have alopecia, and I've known people with it. And, you know, for those who have it, it's very upsetting if you can't come to terms with it. So, you know, to know that there might be some sort of drug type of cure for it, I'm sure is very interesting for some people. But I think, coming back to the Will Smith, you know, if there was a lot of money that changed hands to stage this as a publicity stunt, then I think integrity comes into question here. Because if you're gonna play some mock game around defending your wife's honor, which is essentially what he was playing to, if it was a play, then that's a huge manipulation of the people that are watching and his fan base. Because, I mean, Will Smith is hugely popular, you know, and I like a lot of his films, and to feel like you're being manipulated in that way, I think is about the biggest insult that anybody can do. So I think either way, whichever way this sort of plays out, whatever comes out as the truth, I'm not sure if it ever does, I'm not sure Will Smith can come out of this smelling of roses, to be honest.
No, he's not covered himself in glory, is he? Let's be fair. And like you say, whatever the outcome, it's wrong. And you can see now that the Oscars have kind of reacted, and, you know, I think there's like a 10-year ban placed on him or something like that. People are crying out for him to hand his Oscar back and all that sort of stuff. You know, I think if it was a publicity stunt, maybe that wouldn't have been the case, but I don't know.
Depends.
You know, there could be a bit of washing hands of it from the Oscars, who knows?
Well, there could be that, but also, now this is my cynicism coming through. I tend to believe in this day and age, everything has a price. So I think
it's an acceptable cost.
And there's many different examples of that. But
okay, so, you know, it's not like it needs the money, though, is it? Let's be fair. So
that's the other side of it. But
it's a strange. It's definitely a strange one. And and I know Chris Rock has come out and said afterwards that he had no idea that she had alopecia. He just thought it was a fashion choice.
Right.
So, you know, he didn't have a clue. He just made a bad joke about someone's haircut in the front row. But, you know, who knows?
Yes, who knows? I struggle with that one as well, to be honest.
I think there's a lot. It's a very surreal incident. In isolation, when you look at their careers, and you look at, you know, I mean, God, Ricky Gervais must be sitting there thinking, thank God someone didn't do anything worse to him when he did the Golden Globes for that many years, because he was far more cutting than Chris Rock.
Well, this is so. I watched a comment by Ricky Gervais on this whole issue, and of course, one of the things that he talks about is it is the comedian's role to prick the bubble of celebrities. I mean, it's a descendancy from the idea of the old court jester in medieval times, you know, who had permission to say things to the king and queen that anybody else, if they'd said it, you know, it was off with their head. But the jester had the permission to do that, to, you know, to bring them back down to earth. And of course, that in a lot of comedians take that position today, and it makes for very uncomfortable comedy.
Yeah.
I think that really relates back very nicely to you know, to what we do in working with the clients that we work with, because, you know, very often when you're at the top of a business, and it doesn't matter how big, you know, or small that business is, you know, if you get so bound up with your way of thinking being the right way, you're going to get in trouble, and you need somebody to almost have that court jester role who you give permission to sort of prick your way of thinking. So I don't know what you think about that.
I agree. I think, you know, a lot of people bring in sort of advisors and coaches, consultants to challenge them and challenge their way of thinking, and sometimes there's not an easy way of doing that.
No.
You know, I'm not saying you know, you make fun of someone's alopecia, but you know, you have to burst that bubble sometimes, and you know, and I do think it's an interesting thing, because it sets a dangerous precedent now around offence and jokes.
Yeah.
And, you know, are we now going to see you know, an onslaught of other people reacting that way?
Yeah.
Not just celebrities, because obviously celebrities are role models, and they, you know, but you think about, you know, in a comedy club, you know, you go to a comedy club, sit in the front row, you're painting a target on yourself for the comedians, aren't you?
Yeah.
Now what happens?
Well, I actually had that. Me and my ex went to see God, he's I can't believe this is a real senior moment. He's one of the two hosts on Would I Lie to You? Mac. Oh my God.
Oh, Lee.
Yeah, Lee Mack. That's it. Lee Mack. Thanks for rescuing me from that horrendous moment.
Because I don't watch Would I Lie to You. But yeah.
Okay, that's all right. Well, we went to see him live, and we were in the front row, and we got picked on, and it wasn't comfortable, and he didn't hold back, you know, but the crowd was laughing, and, you know, it's sort of almost, he's going to be the same joke with a different set of people at the next night in the next venue.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But it doesn't make you feel comfortable in the moment. And, you know, this is, you know, Ricky, sorry, I've sort of lost my track now on that, where we were coming from. But yeah, you need these people who can burst your bubble.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not comfortable, but you've got to be willing to, not only do you need the people to burst the bubble, but you've got to be willing and be open to listen to it as well. Because, you know, it's very easy to close yourself off and reject that. And then, because
you're trying to, your instinct is to protect that bubble, isn't it?
It is
at all costs, and that's not always, you know, the benefit to yourself.
Well, I think it's not just not a benefit; it's a detriment, because the minute, and I think this is sort of going on from what I've been reading around the Ukraine and what's going on. So Putin apparently is reducing the number of people in his inner circle, so he's getting a narrower and narrower view of what's going on. And if we can believe what we're being told, that view is only from people who are telling him what he wants to hear. Which is potentially why it's not going the way that he might like. And I was also reading just this morning, actually, about Macron in France, who adopted what's called a Jupiterian style of leadership when he went into the presidency. So before the presidency, he was the man of the people, the man of the media. He was there, and he was like approachable, he was open, and this is a very conscious decision. Apparently his advisory team told him that once he became president, he had to change, he had to become like very presidential. So the Jupiterian type of leadership goes back to Roman times. It's this godlike presence of authority. And so he went from being approachable and open to aloof and distant, you know, and closed, almost overnight. And it's very much affected how he's been perceived as a president. So I know it can be difficult to think, well, how does that relate to me? You know, I run my little, you know, photography business, or my little, you know, shop, whatever it might be. But actually, the principles are the same, aren't they? It doesn't matter what size or what you do.
No, absolutely. And it, you know, applies to everyone as individuals as well. It's not just about business, but you do, you know, you hope that you have friends around you that, you know, prick that bubble when it needs to be pricked. And that's part of growth, isn't it? And development is to constantly have that challenged and pushed. You know, it's part of personal development, it's part of business development. And you know, we all need it. And you know, it's as I say, it sets a dangerous precedent when people, you know, respond to that by physical.
Yeah, do you know, I don't know whether you've picked up on this. I only picked up on it because, as you know, I follow a lot of the work of Jordan Peterson. And with him being Canadian, he's very vocal and active about anything that's going on there. And there's an act being passed in one of the states. I can't remember. It might be Ottawa. I can't remember, but it's to do with racism. So it's about getting rid of racist language. And basically, from what I've read about it, it seems to be that the essence of the legislation is saying that if you are offended, then it doesn't matter what the other person intended. The fact that you are offended essentially makes that other person guilty.
Right.
Which I think goes back to what you were saying. Like, it's very worrying when the emphasis is flipped to that way. It's like, if you're offended, then you're in the right.
You
know, you're in, you know, you can be offended at anything, and just because you're offended,
you're right.
And it makes the other person guilty. And what this is going to do in Ottawa is make that. So if you become identified as somebody who has been offensive to someone else because they deem it to be the case, I think there's some fairly severe punishments that are going to be put in place for that, which I think, as you said, is a very worrying state of affairs.
Yeah, because it sets a precedent then, and where does it end? It's
well, then it sort of questions everything. You know, it's like, well, what is free speech? You know, how do you address anything that's difficult? So bring that back into the workplace. You've got a worker, you've got a member of your team who's not performing very well, and you have a sense of why they're not performing very well. How do you address that without offending them?
Yeah, it's very difficult, isn't it?
I mean, it's hard enough anyway.
It is hard enough anyway. Yeah, it is hard. Yeah, and I guess, you know, obviously different leaders or leadership styles deliver that and deal with that in different ways as well. But it does, you know, by no means we advocate racism or anything like that, but it's but to lose that ability to express and place that interpretation of expression in the hands of the recipient does create problems, because we all know, you know, we all receive things in different ways based on how we're feeling at that time. And you know, those rushes of blood to the head where we think we've got it absolutely right, and then we find out that we haven't got it completely wrong. You know, how do you unravel that?
Well, it becomes really difficult. And I think you know, I love my quotes. So there's a brilliant quote around this subject, which I absolutely think is just on the money, from Eleanor Roosevelt. And what she said was, nobody can offend you without your permission.
Yeah.
And it's so true. It's like, being offended is a choice,
Yeah.
And actually, I don't know, have you ever done this? It's like someone says something to you, deliberately trying to be offensive, but instead of being offended, you laugh at them, or you sort of,
Yeah.
you in some way sort of belittle what they've said.
Yeah. Yeah.
And actually they get even angrier then, because
Oh
it's
yeah,
like,
yeah, because it's not had the desired effect. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
And to me, that is a much more effective way of responding to people who are trying to be offensive. I think there's a
yeah, yeah,
difference between people who are trying to be offensive, and someone who's offensive accidentally. I
yeah,
think are different things.
yeah.
Um, Although my dad did used to say, never offend anybody accidentally.
Really.
So, I mean, I know that you've had these situations professionally and personally, but
Yeah.
if you're in a situation where you've got to handle this type of conversation, how would you go about doing it?
You just got to take a moment, haven't you? I mean, there are lots of techniques in doing that as well. One of the common in current sort of climate, email is the biggest offender.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And messages, when people
Yeah,
send messages.
yeah,
It's very emotive. It's always a representative of that moment in time when someone sends something,
yeah,
and how you receive it is always based on your moment in time.
yeah,
During
absolutely.
that time when you read it.
Yeah,
And so in terms of recommending on that, is I always say get your thoughts out and just take some time and sit on it and revisit it,
yeah,
rather than send it. Sometimes if you feel like there's a rush of blood to the head, to get that out of your system
mm,
and verbalize it, but without obviously relaying it to someone.
yeah.
Write it down, take it down, and then just take some time out away from it and come back to it.
So that works if you're not in the moment, right? But
If you're not in the moment,
if you're in a conversation with someone, or if you're in a situation like where you're front seat of the Oscars and
yeah,
someone seemingly insults your wife, how do you deal with it in that moment?
yeah. For me, I think you can't be afraid of silence, and the expectation of a response. I don't think you can be afraid to actually process it, and just buy yourself that time to process. Whether that's verbalizing that or just letting it sit with you. I mean, obviously Will Smith's initial response was a laugh.
Mm-hmm.
Was that even his attempt to deal with it, and then it didn't work and he had to get up and act on it? Who knows?
Yeah,
Only
yeah.
Will Smith knows that. But generally it's to just take that moment, I think. I mean, you can only prepare for so much as well when you're going into these environments.
Yeah.
Prepare. I'm sure Chris Rock hadn't prepared for that.
Mm-hmm. So how would you handle this, Chris? It's like, and I'm sure you have been in a situation like this. Somebody has said something to you, and it's either completely offensive, or it's just downright wrong, and you feel like your rage has been triggered, like you're absolutely outraged by it, but you can't react like that. But at the same time, you also don't want to let them get away with what they've said, because to let them get away with it is not the right thing to do either. So how do you handle something like that?
I think that's an interesting point you just touched on there about letting someone get away with it.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, what I've learned is that is half the problem. Is not being prepared to let someone get away with something. I think it goes back to your quote about permission, giving
Mm-hmm.
permission to be offended.
Okay.
And so I think that's where all the emotional stuff comes into it, really. Particularly if that's been said in front of someone else. We go back to this Will Smith situation where it's been said about his wife. But
yeah.
For me, I just take a deep breath, and I actually go. I tend to just retract within and think. And what I found quite recently, actually, because I've been triggered very recently,
Hmm.
is that that's now very obvious when I do that, and then when
Right.
someone knows I've been triggered.
Yeah.
But generally, I don't say anything
Hmm.
to begin with until
Which
I
is very
formulate.
common, by the way.
Sorry.
That's a very common reaction to being
Yeah,
triggered.
just until I can formulate my
Yeah.
thoughts.
Yeah.
But what I've learned is if you don't, you can get caught up on that letting someone get away with it notion and
Hmm.
feel like you have to almost settle the score or set the record straight. And I think when and because my experience was sort of, I was trying to apply rational thinking to something that was very irrational,
Hmm.
and they're never going to match up. And I was never ever going to have that. There was never going to be a response that I could ever give
No.
that would wipe that slate clean or
Hmm.
level the other person or make them
Yeah.
recognize what they said was wrong or any of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And so I've learned what that's done actually for my tolerance
Mm.
is massive.
Yeah.
Because I can just sort of go, right, I'll let that go.
Yeah.
And typically I just think if I know, sometimes you can have a time and to respond and come back, which is
Hmm.
great.
Hmm.
But if it's something that's designed to trigger or does trigger,
Mm.
I tend to just take a deep breath and let it
Yeah.
go.
Well, that's a very spiritual response, because I've I've done a lot of reading around this,
Yeah.
and I've brought that aspect into my life relatively late in life, but it's made a huge difference to me. And spiritual teachings that I've read certainly talk about letting it go, but the other thing that they also talk about is never defend. Never defend yourself, because it's in that moment of defending yourself, you actually validate the attack.
Yeah, exactly. You give it energy.
You do. And actually that then translates, if for anyone who's ever done martial arts, and it's not that I've done it personally, but I used to take my son to do Taekwondo, and so I used to stay there and watch the lessons and hear the teacher. And of course, like many people, I'm a great fan of Bruce Lee and his teachings.
Yeah.
And so that idea of using or using your opponent's energy against them, and allowing that to sort of play out is a very powerful way of dealing with these emotional situations. But of course, it's a skill that you have to learn. It doesn't come naturally.
No, and it's very difficult as well, depending on what's being thrown at you. It's still very difficult. But having had those incidents where I have reacted and allowed that to get to me.
Yeah.
They never end well, do they? Let's be fair.
Well, that's my experience as well. That's my experience as well. I mean,
so
sometimes if you're married to the person, sometimes, or you're going out with them, sometimes you can kiss and make up. And things can become better afterwards.
Some things you can never take back, can you? And some things are never forgotten.
No, exactly.
And I'm just not a big believer in that. I do still dwell on stuff quite a lot afterwards and give that thought and make notes about why I'm feeling like that, try and unravel it. But it is very difficult. It's a very difficult skill to master.
It is. But I think that's the key. The word that you've just used there is it's a skill to master. And like any skill, it's like you don't rock up at Wimbledon never having played tennis before and hope to get a game. Exactly. You got to start at the beginning. You got to develop and practice. And if you've got talent, develop that talent.
Yeah.
There's a reason why the guys like Roger Federer and Nadal and Andy Murray and all that practice so hard. It's like, it doesn't matter how much talent you've got, you've still got to work to develop that talent. And it doesn't matter what you're talking about. And this idea of emotional control is a skill, it's a talent, and you got to practice it, and you got to practice the right things. And it's no different to playing tennis, playing golf, playing football,
no different
whatever.
To any other skill.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, and obviously playing basketball, you had to deal with that a lot as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I've seen people not deal with it.
Well, I think we all have, yeah. And I think we've.
I mean, life's going to throw you challenges, and it's not going to always agree with your opinion or your view, and you're going to get people that you come across that will challenge you,
Mm.
and you'll get people that you come across that will upset you.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's part of life.
It is.
And I think, like you say, about giving energy and validating things. I think that can be quite a dangerous thing, because you're giving that power away to someone else to hold over you.
So have you got, like, having said step back, let it go, have you got like one tip or one piece of advice about how someone could actually do that, how they could actually step out their emotions and do what you've said?
For me, I just take a deep breath and generally try and clear my head of what's been said.
Okay.
And in terms of clearing my head, I try and detach the emotional connection to the words that have been used, because sometimes it can be one word that's used, can't it? It can be one word that you just have taken offense to. And
that's why it's called a trigger.
Yeah, exactly. But it can be just one word in a sentence, and the whole sentence might be quite innocent, but they've just chosen one word. So for me, I tend to just try and take a deep breath and then almost deconstruct what's been said, see it from the other person's perspective, if that's possible. And sometimes it isn't always. And then ask, what do you mean by that?
Well, that aligns to a piece of advice that I can't remember whether I was given this advice or whether I came across it, which is exactly sort of you're moving towards this, which is when anyone says anything to you that you find offensive or annoying, whatever word you want to put on it, you just say, thank you. That's a very interesting perspective.
Yeah.
Now, you might not feel like saying that out loud, but actually, even if you say it in your own head and only you hear it, it's that I've found it to be incredibly powerful, actually, because it does exactly what you've just said. It's like somehow it switches you into their perspective. And I actually had a situation this weekend where someone said something to me, which was on the sort of upper level of going between irritating and annoying. And I to be honest, in that moment, I didn't remember to say, "Oh, thanks, that's an interesting perspective." But as I was
slap them, though, did you?
I didn't slap them. No. I didn't slap them because they were paying for coffee. So, but it was only after the event that I then said, "Well, why would they have said something like that?" And then I got myself into their shoes, and then it all unraveled and everything. Then I made some sense of it, and it was all okay. It's like,
and I think you got to be realistic as well. You can't always do that in a moment. So don't think that you can.
No.
Reflection, that you can never underestimate the power of reflection on those sorts of things, and the ability for that to actually calm you. I think a lot of people might go over it and over it and over it and make it a bigger deal, but once you detach the emotion, it can help an awful lot.
So I think my takeaway from all this is, unless you're a multi-millionaire like Will Smith and you're potentially getting another bountiful payday,
slapping whoever you want willy-nilly.
Or I was going to say don't slap anyone, but there you go.
Brilliant.